Hello, Influence 2021. What a remarkable honor and privilege it is to be invited to this incredible event. I love that I get to tune in to you guys virtually from across the world, even though I will love it a little bit more when I am in person. But for now, let us be grateful for the small mercy that is the internet. So, as you have heard, I will be speaking about forgiveness. I don't know about you, but I've had a very complicated and complex relationship with forgiveness. I think it's all the things I heard growing up. It's all the sayings like forgive and forget, and I never quite understood it. I never quite got it, especially on an emotional level. Like, I think many of us can comprehend forgiveness on a very mental level, but when it comes to really living it and really feeling it, it's a very different experience. But before I jump in, you're probably thinking, who is this chick? And why does she get to talk about forgiveness? So I want to actually start my story right at the beginning. In 1991, I was born in the beautiful country that is South Africa. We are known for our incredible vineyards, our wonderful wildlife, our incredibly dynamic and mixed ethnicity pool. However, we also happen to be known for our deeply oppressive past. So, in 1991, I was born to my beautiful Xhosa dad, who was 25 at the time. I also happened to be born to my remarkably breathtaking mother, who happened to be half Italian and half Tswana. She was 24 at the time. Just a few months after my birth, unfortunately, my father was brutally murdered by an apartheid assassin by the name of Eugene de Kock. As I grew up, I would hear small stories about my dad being told, but I didn't really have a relationship with him or the concept of why he had passed away. However, I got to around the age of 9. And I remember, my mom bought this book. It was called Into the Heart of Darkness by Jacques Poe. And on the cover of this book were a couple of different faces. But my mom pointed at the one face, and I remember she looked at me and she said, "This is the man who killed your father." And that image was forever burnt in my brain. And I remember thinking, why did he kill my father? Who is this man? Why is he so cruel? Why is he so evil? I would ask myself all these questions, but I would always keep them at the back of my mind. However, whenever we would have guests visiting, I remember my mother would say to me, "Quickly, go get the book." And I would run and I would jump on the chair and I'd get the book and I'd take it to my mom. And every single time she would send me out of the room. And I would sit outside the door, and every time without fail, people would either start screaming or crying. And I started thinking, what is in this book that makes people react this way? And I started listening. And I remember someone mentioning that it was a picture of my father. At the time, I only owned about 4 or 5 pictures of my dad. And I really wanted to see the 6th one. I was like, oh my goodness, if I can get to just see one more picture of this person. And I remembered, I thought to myself, I'm going to listen to what page everyone turns to. And it didn't happen that day. But as the days went by and every time people would visit, I would eavesdrop. And eventually I got my opportunity. I heard what page everyone turned to. I ran to my room, I quickly wrote down the number, and I waited for my opportunity to be home alone. That day came sooner than I expected. My mom needed to leave the house. And I remember I looked out the window and I saw her car reverse out the driveway. And I quickly ran to the bedroom. I stood on the chair, I pulled the book, and I sat at the edge of the bed. I was so excited. However, as I started paging through this book, I started seeing certain images come up. And I started to realize that the picture of my dad I might see may not be the best picture. However, I got to the page, and as I turned to it, what I saw was a picture of my dad's burnt body clutching a steering wheel. And I remember my heart started to race, tears welled up in my eyes, and I quickly shut the book and I threw it at the back of the cupboard and I ran to my room. To me, that picture was forever burnt in my mind. It looked like something that you would see in a CGI movie. And I remember just thinking to myself, what did my dad do to deserve such a brutal death? And from that day on, I remember I just started to change. I started to become depressed. I started to become more serious, as people would call it. However, my mom didn't see any changes really. She just thought puberty was hitting in. But as I got to around the age of 16, the depression had really set into my character. I was just known as someone who was highly competitive and someone who was just like, who could go off at the drop of a hat. But one evening, I remember I went to bed and my heart was just racing. And I remember feeling the sharp pain in my chest. And I went to my mother's room and I said, look, I think I'm having a heart attack. My mom looked at me and she quickly said to me, get to the car. She put on her pajamas and we quickly raced out of the driveway and we got to the hospital. When I reached the hospital, they rushed me into evaluation. And I remember I had to spend the evening over. In the morning, however, I remember I woke up and the doctor said to us, I need to see you and your mother when she gets here. I remember being so afraid. What could he have found? What is he going to say to us? You know? And so when my mother arrived, we went to go see the doctor. And I remember the doctor looked at me with such great concern in his face. And he said to my mother and I, in the over 20 years of practice, I have never seen stress symptoms so severe in someone your age. He followed with the words, your body is killing you. And if you don't change what you're doing, you're going to die. Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. I was no stranger to suicidal thoughts. I was no stranger to suicide in and of itself. But all of a sudden, having choice taken away from me and understanding that at the age of 16, I could die. Death at the time had been something that was reserved for the old. It was for down there, down the line. It was not for someone who was a competitive athlete. It was not for a 16-year-old. But most importantly, it was not for me. And I remembered a couple of weeks later, I was walking and a thought hit my mind. And the thought was, Eugene killed your father, and now you're letting him kill you too. That thought became the single biggest catalyst to my change and to my progress. So fast forward a couple of years later, I reach around the age of 23 and I am alive and I'm thinking to myself, whew, I have outlived my diagnosis. And I remember I get home from the gym and thinking nothing of it, thinking it's just another day. My mother calls me and she says to me, hey, I just got a call from the National Prosecuting Authorities, and they want to know if we'd like to meet Eugene. Immediately, I said yes, but my heart just stopped because I had not thought of Eugene in the past few years. And never would I have thought that I would get the opportunity to see him face to face. And so I remembered as soon as I said yes, my mom said to me, look, if no one wants to go, I won't go. But if just one of you wants to go, I'll definitely come with you. And I looked at her again and I said, I will definitely go. Because I understood in that moment that if I did not see Eugene, it would be something I would regret for the rest of my life. As the days and weeks went by, my mother and my brother and I would have these dinner table conversations that sometimes they'd say, no, we're not going. Yes, we're going. But I knew with 100% conviction I would go. When the day came, I remember the National Prosecuting Authorities decided that they would pick us up, and my whole family decided to go, including my grandfather, who was the father to my dad. And so that day we drove to Kosimampura prison, which is based in Pretoria, about an hour away from where we were living at the time. As we drove there, I didn't really have expectations. I didn't try to think about it. However, when we arrived, instead of being met by the steely, cold, gray, sterile prison, instead where we were led to was this dining room area. It looked very antiqued. It was warm. It was kind of like visiting an old relative who had like this antique furniture. And there were scones and there was tea and there was biscuits at the corner. And I remember thinking, this is such a stark contradiction to what is about to happen. And I remember the warden of the prison welcomed us and he said, please help yourself to some scones, help yourself to some tea. And so we did. And as we sat down, we just fell into formation. So it was a long dining room table. And I ended up sitting on the end of the one long side. And it was myself, it was my younger brother, it was my older brother, it was my grandfather, it was my mother. And then on the other side was the warden of the prison and someone who worked in the prison. And across from me was all the National Prosecuting Authority members. On the one side was the priest who was sitting the closest to me, and next to him was an empty chair, which would then be for Eugene. As we sat there, I remember they briefed us and they said, Eugene will walk in at any minute now. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, we will stop the meeting and we will send him back to his cell. And I remembered we continued to speak amongst ourselves while we waited for Eugene to arrive. And I believe I was the first one to turn around. As I turned around, as if out of magic, out of thin air, I saw Eugene sitting there. I had not heard him come in. I had not seen him. He was already sitting and he was everything that I had pictured him to be. I remembered seeing him and seeing the flash of that picture I saw at 9 years old. He looked exactly the same as if he was frozen in time. He was a big man with his glasses and his belly, but that was the only thing that had changed, his belly. And I remember looking at him and thinking, okay. And the priest saw the shock on my face and he started to resume the meeting. And he said, okay, Mama family, Eugene has arrived. And I remembered the priest introduced each and every one of us, starting with my mother, who was the furthest. And he said, that is Sandra Mama, widow of the deceased Glennock Masilo Mama. And Eugene leaned forward and he said, pleasure to meet you. And he leaned back. And then he went to my grandfather, my brothers, and then myself. And with each and every one of us, Eugene would lean forward and say, pleasure to meet you. And he would lean back. And so the priest started and he said, who wants to go first? And I remembered my mother asked, she said, hi, Eugene. I just want to know what happened to my husband. Because my family at the time was seeing the news when my father was killed, and all it had reported was terrorists were shot in a shootout. That is it. My father was classified a terrorist and he was in the shootout that had occurred. So we had never known the true details. What my mom did know was that my father was killed in a brutal manner. So Eugene went on to explain, and he said, my father was identified as a troublemaker, as they would say. And so what Eugene and his team decided to do was send an askari. For those of you who don't know, an askari was someone who was working for both sides of the government. And so they sent this man into my father's camp to win over my father's favor. And as he won over my father's trust, he set them up in a very, small mission. And he just said to my father, listen, what you need to do is just drive certain people into Nelspruit, leave them there, and you get to drive back home. My father, having been a very skilled driver, didn't think anything of it because he did it so frequently. And so the day came, and my father went with 3 other gentlemen, including the askari, in the car towards Nelspruit, which was about an hour and a half drive from where he was. And as they drove into Nelspruit and they were approaching the Nelspruit Bridge, the askari said to my father, listen, I need to get out here really quickly and go do something. But you keep following that BMW and you will be fine and you'll get to where you need to go. And I'm sure my father, thinking nothing of it at the time, followed this BMW under the bridge. And as my father approached the Nelspruit Bridge, men on both sides started firing at my father's minibus. Eugene, seeing from the top of the bridge that the minibus wasn't coming to a stop, he ran down the bridge and he emptied out his magazine cartridge on my father. When the car came to a stop and Eugene still spotted signs of life in the vehicle, he doused them all in fuel and he set them alight. So that was the first time we heard such graphic detail of my father's final moments. And so the conversation continued. And my mother said, but Eugene, there were so many activists, there were so many people. Why my husband? And I think Eugene said the hardest thing I'd heard up till that point. He said, no reason. So there was no reason my father needed to die on that day. So the conversation continued amongst us. We shared a lot between Eugene and my family. And I remembered my mother got to a point and she said, Eugene, I just want to say, I forgive you. Then my grandfather said, okay, well, if she forgives you, then I forgive you. Then my brother said, I forgive you. And my other brother said, I forgive you. And then it got to me. And it was the first time in that whole encounter I could speak. And I remember I said, hi, Eugene. And he looked at me and he said, hi. And I said, I want to say I forgive you. But before I do, I want to ask you one thing. And he looked at me and he said, anything. What's that? And I said, I want to know, do you forgive yourself? And he looked at me, and for the first time in the whole encounter, he seemed a little shaken. And he looked at me and he said, every time a family comes here, that is one question I hope they never ask me. And he looked away and he wiped the side of his eye because a tear had come down. And he looked back at me and he said, when you've done the things I've done, how do you forgive yourself? And I remember in that moment, I just began to sob. I started to cry and cry and cry. But what surprised me was that I wasn't crying for myself. What I realized was he was just a human being sitting in front of me. And no matter what I said and no matter what I did, I could not take away his pain, nor could he take away mine. And so as I continued to cry, the priest asked, is there anything else? And I remember I said no, my family said no. And so the priest said, okay, we will conclude the meeting. And so I happened to be sitting the closest to Eugene. So I got up first and I walked around the priest and I got to Eugene and I said, Eugene, would you mind if I gave you a hug? And he looked at me confused and, a little shocked. And he got up, towering over me, and he held me really tightly. And he said, I'm so sorry for what I've done. And your father would have been so proud of the woman you've become. And I remembered I went my way. I left Eugene there. And as I left the prison, I remember thinking to myself, wow, I came here to set a prisoner free. I had no idea. But what I didn't realize is that I set two prisoners free that day. One was myself, and the other was Eugene. I went on to advocate for Eugene's parole, which he later received. But I share the story with you today, not to impress you, not to say, oh my God, Candace, this is a story, and thank you for sharing the story, you're so cool. No, I share the story with you today because I know within my experience that life is going to test each and every one of us. You, me, the host, everyone. And whether we regard it as big T trauma, which is what people would regard my trauma as, right? It's this big trauma, like anyone would be angry, anyone would be sad, anyone would be affected. Or what I call little T trauma, the traumas that chip away at us, but they're not big enough, as we like to define it, to be spoken about or to be addressed. And I think all trauma is equal. If it is still hurting you, if it is still something that impacts you, if it is still something that impacts your actions, it is a trauma worth being looked at. It is a trauma worth being addressed. It is a trauma worth being acknowledged. And so, what have I learned through my experience? What have I learned through this evolution of forgiveness. As I said to you in the beginning, forgiveness to me was not something that came easily. It wasn't a magic wand. And contrary to popular belief, I wasn't kissed by an angel when I was born. No. But forgiveness to me, what I started to realize was it gave me control over my life. What do I mean by this? So I believe that each and every one of us has this emotional control pad in our souls, right? And so when we are not healed, people can press those little buttons to ignite an emotion out of us. Have you ever thought to yourself, oh, Jerry always gets under my skin, or my mom is always on my nerves? Because they know just the right buttons to push. And until you can look at and heal those buttons, you do not have control over your life. How I looked at it was, until I could forgive, I was like a little puppet, and someone else had control over my emotions. And they were just playing the drum. And whenever I think about them, I no longer had control. I would lose my mind. I'd get palpitations. I'd get angry. I would lose my health. And I remembered thinking to myself that Eugene was my puppet master. And so he got to control my emotional well-being, while I was just a victim, I would say, an innocent bystander to my own life. And although we are never responsible for what happens to us, we are responsible for how we move through it. And so to me, what I started to see was that before, when I was living in resentment, anger, depression, and sadness, it was like I was wearing these glasses. And so it likens it to, I have like seeing problems, so I have to wear contact lenses. But I remember I hadn't been to my optometrist in a while. And so I thought I was seeing life perfectly. I thought everyone saw life in granulated images, okay? And I remember I got to my optometrist and she started changing the lenses. And eventually I got to the prescription that was right for me. And I remember thinking to myself when I got my new prescription, oh my goodness, is this how everyone has been seeing life? Is life actually HD and I've been seeing it in standard definition? And I think that's exactly what happens. I think when we start living in anger, resentment, in all these things that we like, but I can't forgive this, I can't release this. What it does is it slowly begins to diminish your vision of life. And guess who suffers? It's not the person who hurt you. It's not the person who did that awful thing. It's not the people. It's not the situation that suffers. It's you. It's your family. It's your wife. It's your husband. It's your partner. It's your kids. Because when we do not heal what hurt us, we will bleed on all of those around us. And so I say to you, do not forgive because it is like the holy thing to do, or it's like for the other person. I cannot forgive them, Candace. You don't understand. My father left me. My mom didn't love me. My boyfriend, my husband walked out on me after 30 years. I cannot forgive that. And I will ask you, if you hold on to it, who is the person who's being hurt? And I look at it and I think to myself, how did I imprison myself? How was I imprisoned in my mind? My life is literally polar opposite to what it was while I was living in resentment, anger, and pain. There's no ways I would have been on main stage speaking to all of you incredible people if I was still angry, if I was still resentful. There's no ways I would have known how to love somebody else if I was still living in anger and resentment. And we do it in the micro moments. Everyone thinks, oh, it's the big things. It's when I explode. It's when I do this. No, it's in the small actions. It's in your worthiness. It's when you look at yourself and you're like, ooh, I can't charge this client this much, even though I know I'm skilled. I can't, ask of what I want from my partner, even though I know he's bridging my boundaries. Because all of those things come down to that wound within you that said, but Candace, if I was lovable, my mother wouldn't have left me. If I was lovable, that assault wouldn't have occurred to me. If I was lovable, my dad would still be around. If I was lovable, my business would have succeeded. The truth is, none of that is true. None of it. And when we look at external situations and we allow them to define our souls, and we allow them to define our spirits, and we allow them to cloud our vision, then we live a life that, although the trauma happened once, I always talk to people about trauma being the first point of impact. The moment that incident happens, the moment we experience that pain, the moment the crash occurs, that is the first moment of impact. That is the first point of the trauma. However, every time we relive it in our brains, every time we have that emotional reaction that we cannot control, that is it happening again and again and again. And therefore, the trauma is no longer this one incident that happened to you. It is those million moments that trauma ripples through your soul, ripples through your life. And so today, I implore you to just look at your life. I don't say you have to forgive. I don't think anyone has to do anything. But what I do want you to do is just choose yourself. If there's nothing you take from this talk, I hope that the only thing you will take is choosing you. You deserve the life of your dreams. You deserve the relationship of your dreams. You deserve the job of your dreams. You deserve the income of your dreams. You deserve everything you could ever hope for from your soul. And when you are living in the patterns of trauma, when you are living in the patterns of wounding, when you are unhealed, the situation that happens is that at the deep subconscious level, although you think to yourself, oh, I'm not going to forgive them or this or that, because I don't want them to feel better about themselves. The truth is, they probably don't care. So when you decide to give away your power, it just takes away from you. It just takes away from the magnificence, the brilliance, the loving being that you are. Because no one wants to pay for another's sins, right? I mean, we see it all the time when someone gets into a relationship and they say, no, I cannot love again because they hurt me. Guess what? We've all been hurt. That's what life is. Life is a series of beautiful moments that put us on cloud nine, but it's also filled with trauma and pain. And this is the roller coaster, because without the darkness, there is no light. When you've never experienced pain, how will you know the maximum feeling of joy? And so as I wrap up, I know that I do not have all day today, and you've got phenomenal speakers still coming up on this incredible platform. I just want to just ask of you to just let you know that I see your brilliance. I see your magnificence. I know that that soul dream you have is a huge, huge, huge possibility for you. I know that anything you want in life can happen. I am a living testament of it. And I am not special. I really am not special. But what I want you to know is that although you were not responsible for what happened, you have so much power to change your story. This is your movie. This is your movie, guys. I'm just an extra in your movie. You are the leading role in your movie. If you don't like the cast, change it. If you don't like the storyline, change it. If you don't like the way the script has been written up to this point, you get to change it. You get to look back on those experiences and say, this thing was built to destroy me. But guess what? I am a victor. This is my story. I am the hero of my story. And I rose above it. How do I know this? Because I'm still standing. I still get to define it. I still get to choose what happens from this point forward. So, as I play a very small role in your movie, I pray and I hope that you will live the movie that you know you are destined to live. Thank you for your time. Thank you for journeying with me through this talk. And thank you to Influence 2021 for the honor and the privilege of allowing me to share myself with each and every one of you. I wish you nothing but greatness, love, abundance in all you do moving forward. Thank you so much. And I hope our paths will cross again soon. Take care.